if you're J.K. Rowling, globalisation has meant that your book, instead of just being kind of quite a big thing for the British market, sells hundreds of millions of copies in China and India. And so you've done really well. The biggest reduction in human poverty since humans existed. I mean, literally, a third of the world was living at subsistence in 1990, and now it's a tenth of the world. Unexplained wealth. We want to know, you seem awfully rich for a cellist, and we'd like to know how a cellist gets to have $2 billion. But in 1999, I invested in a small startup called Google. And, it's turned out quite well. And if I hadn't done, if I'd stopped investing in 99 because there was a sort of mad frenzy, we wouldn't have had a Google.
Joining us today is Evan Davis, the host of BBC's nightly current affairs programme Newsnight, as well as the BBC4 radio programme The Bottom Line. He is well known as the presenter of the business reality show Dragon's Den and has written several books, the latest of which is entitled Post-Truth, Why We Have Reached Peak Bullshit and What We Can Do About It. Evan sets out to explain why there is so much dishonesty, nonsense and deception in public discourse, and why it has become more of a concern, especially since 2016. Evan, welcome to St. Paul's.
Thank you very much for having me, Charlie. It's great to be here.
So next year, or in a couple of years' time, many of us will be going to university or some alternative to that, in my case, a gap year. And we're always told to pursue the things that we love to do, and we'll be great at them.
Yeah.
When did you decide that journalism was your passion, and how did that passion for you get ignited?
Yeah, so I was very much into politics and economics when I was at school, in my sixth form. I loved arguing. I spent a lot of time arguing, and I had friends, and we just argued all day, and in a good way. And I kind of thought politics, journalism, communication, that kind of thing. And when I went to university, I went into journalism. I sort of fell into that at college, and I edited the student newspaper. In the end, it was quite competitive. But
this was
at Oxford? Yeah. The Charwell was the student newspaper, still is. And at Oxford, you get a term to edit these things. In order for more people to have a go, you only get one term, which is 8 weeks at Oxford. And I think a lot of other universities, if you get one of these jobs, it's a year. But at Oxford, it's just basically 2 months. It's nothing. So I got my 2-month stint at that. It allows more people to put on their CV that they've edited the student newspaper. So I did that. And then, but this is the crucial strategic decision I made for my career, Charlie, was not to go into politics, not to go into journalism when I left university. I said, even though that's my passion, I'm not going to do that till I'm 30, because I want to just get some more substance about me. I want to sort of find out something before I start being a pontificator on it.
Okay.
And I kind of would encourage everyone here who's dreaming of being George Osborne or dreaming of being a kind of a journalist. I would sort of say the most important thing is to have a specialism or a life or a hinterland other than the politics or the journalism. And in my case, it was economics. I worked in it, I then studied it some more, and then I worked in it some more, and then I became an economics journalist. And I think that was a really good way of doing it. It just meant I knew something about the world, about some little piece of the world, before I became a journalist. And I meet loads of people who say, I want to be a journalist or I want to be a TV presenter. I want to be a TV presenter, how do I do it? And I say, well, go and learn something about something else and then try and be a TV presenter, because you can be a TV presenter for a few years on the basis of your looks and your ability to read an auto cue, but actually the ones who have a lasting career have got some knowledge about something, whatever it is, sport, religion, food, wine, golf. It can be any plants, it can be anything, but just have some actual platform on which you can stand and launch your career.
So, as you said, you have an extensive background in economics, as you were just mentioning. And so with the shifts that technology and networking are causing, to what extent do you think that the economics we're taught in school now is still valid and relevant and still applies in today's world?
Oh, that's a good one. Look, I actually suspect most of what you're taught in economics is really, really useful. And this is the right answer, isn't it? I think it's probably really useful. However, I think it is the big thing that's happened in economics in the last 15 or 20 years, mostly after the financial crash of a decade ago, is the understanding that the economic models that have dominated our subject, they have real insight and they're really useful, but they do not entirely capture the realities of the world. And so the world is more complicated. So it's not that you want to throw the models away. A lot of universities are having kind of economic student uprisings where the students are saying, we want to be taught more Marxism and we want to be taught alternative approaches. I don't think that's right. I mean, I actually think traditional economics has a lot of good insight in it. So you need to understand it, but you also need to understand its limitations. And I'd say in particular, the psychological elements, the behavioral economics. Do those of you know economics, know the words behavioral economics? The intersection of economics and psychology has been a kind of quite rich seam of interesting it complicates the sort of simple picture. So a lot of the economics we're taught basically assumes we're all rational. And actually we're not rational. And the way we're not rational is interesting and systematic and predictable. And so I think it's worth studying and understanding the rational models, but also it's worth understanding that we're human beings and we're not rational. So no, I think your models are fine. And for all the technology stuff, I don't think it's changing the world, but it's not changing the fundamental dynamics of competition and the way people behave. And I think the right way to think about economics, how many of you are doing economics out of interest, are studying economics at the moment? Good. So the right way to understand it is not as a kind of, the right way to understand it, it's a toolkit. Marginal analysis, opportunity cost, comparative advantage. These are all little tools that just help you understand and analyse problems, and they don't go away because we're living in a world where artificial intelligence is more important. This is all very relevant.
So one of the largest shocks to the system with respect to economics in 2017 were the rise of cryptocurrencies. So Bitcoin, Ethereum, list goes on. Do you think these cryptocurrencies?
It's bollocks.
But do you think that they?
Sorry,
No. Do you think that they have, in a sense, maybe not necessarily small but big,
There's always this stuff. Every bubble has a really important grain of truth in it, okay? So it's absolutely true that distributed ledger technology, I'm absolutely prepared to believe that there is something there which will turn out to be very important. But the fad for putting blockchain at the end of your company name and watching the share prices soar truly is just the latest incarnation in which a particular generation of people learn what a bubble is.
What do you think the future is? Do you think there is a future?
I don't know. I'm sure that I'm told that these things are really important and will have a future. I'm absolutely prepared to believe that. But the scale of everybody launching their own cryptocurrency and this is just, the latest version of stuff we've seen before. I mean, the most interesting one, which I'm afraid we didn't live through, was the dot-com boom in around the late 90s. And so this is when the internet was coming. And you have to understand that was a proper big shock when we'd had computers, and then suddenly this kind of linking of them all came through the mid-90s. And it was like, wow, this is really big. And people were saying, this is going to transform retailing, which it has. It'll transform music, which it has. It'll transform media, which it has. And travel agency. And everyone could see it was going to do that. And share prices started, if people put .com on the name of their company, their share price would jump. And, there was no doubt it was a huge thing. But it was also the case that it was a completely ridiculous bubble. And it was entirely predictable that a lot of the companies that launched, when their price fell, they weren't going to fall by 30%. They were going to fall by 99%. I mean, the share prices were 100 times what they should have been. And there was a culling of the sort of the nonsense. And you were left with a core of really good stuff. Now, so here's the big question. In order to get the benefits of .coms, or in order to get the benefits of cryptocurrencies, of which there undoubtedly will be some, the question is, do you need the mad bubble to kind of excite and generate the investment and the interest in it? So I was speaking to a venture capitalist about the .com bubble. He's a big venture capitalist, Michael Moritz. He lives in Silicon Valley. He's a huge guy. And I was saying to him, it was all nonsense, wasn't it? By 99, it was obviously just nonsense. And he said, and this is a really, really interesting answer. Yes, he said, well, you could say that. It was obviously overpriced and nonsense. But in 1999, I invested in a small startup called Google. And, it's turned out quite well. And if I hadn't done, if I'd stopped investing in 99 because there was a sort of mad frenzy, we wouldn't have had a Google. And Google, by the way, is worth way more than all the money that was lost in the .com bubble. So there is a kind of really interesting question about whether bubbles serve a public purpose. But my advice is don't get sucked into them. If they serve a public purpose, let other people lose money on them rather than losing your own.
So now I think...
How many of you invested in this nonsense? Have some of you done it? I get sort of...
I'm guilty.
Okay.
Luckily it went very well, but I'm out now, so...
Good.
Moving swiftly on, I think, I can't do an interview with you without talking about Brexit, sort of the elephant in the room. And you've had the extraordinary benefit and privilege of talking to some of the leading politicians and business people surrounding the subject. And as I was mentioning, in an ever increasingly networked world with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, why do you think the British people would have chosen to unplug from a network, in this case the EU, without having another equally vast network to plug into?
Okay, that's an absolutely huge question, Charlie, and a really good one. So I shy away from trying to find the one explanation, okay? Because when the vote is so close, virtually everything is a decisive explanation, but the explanation that I would point to is that the world has been a bewildering place for a lot of people in the last 20 years. And the basic story of the world in the last 20 years is it has been fantastic if you're very rich. If you're J.K. Rowling, globalisation has meant that your book, instead of just being kind of quite a big thing for the British market, sells hundreds of millions of copies in China and India. And so you've done really well. Roger Federer is 100 times richer than the Roger Federer of 50 years ago, because somehow globalization has sort of given big returns to the rich. And it's given very big returns, fantastic returns, to the poorest people in the world, or among them. So literally hundreds of millions of people, mostly in China, have come out of subsistence poverty to a kind of middle income standard where they might have a DVD player and running water. And that has been, without, I think, much dispute, the biggest reduction in human poverty since humans existed. I mean, literally, a third of the world was living at subsistence in 1990, and now it's a tenth of the world. So we've gone, and subsistence is basically the default experience of human beings. It's you just live, cover your basic nutrition, and die. I mean, that's been what most human beings have endured. And a third of the world was that in 1990, and now it's a tenth. So something really big has happened, and really good. And the penalty for that has been paid by poorer people in rich countries. So if you're a Chinese peasant scratching around in the earth with no security in 1990, you now might have a house or a small apartment with running water, a TV and a DVD player. If you are a poorish person, a manual worker in a rich country, you've basically seen the best jobs go to China. You have got insecurity, and you've seen your town and your community left without a lot. And the place you need to go to see this is not London, is not Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool. These big cities have actually coped quite well. All the action in the economy is in big cities. You need to go to small cities and big towns. Burnley, Barnsley, Wigan, Bolton, Middlesbrough, Stoke, Wolverhampton. It's all these kinds of places that voted for Brexit. When you go to them, there's a lot of dereliction. We haven't found an economic role for them. And I think it's unsurprising if you live in those places, you say, I want, whatever the rules are, I want them to change. And I suspect that had quite a lot to do with the vote.
And again, huge question. Looking into your crystal ball, what do you see for the future of Britain outside the European Union, in short?
Right.
I know
so I'm afraid I can't offer any opinions because I work for the BBC. So they're surgically removed from us when we're appointed. Let me say this. If you're a conventional economist and you believe the conventional economic models, the estimates that the Treasury produced, called Project Fear in the referendum campaign, which showed something between a 2% decline in income and a 10% decline in income, those models are what conventional economics tells you happens to the British economy, okay? That is what happens. And the Treasury produced those, and George Osborne attached spurious precision to them, which was much criticised. But and it's a big span of estimates. But that is what happened. That the economy in 2030 is anything between 2 and 10% poorer than it would otherwise be. We would probably expect to be richer in 2030 than we are now. That would be normal. The economy tends to grow. But it won't grow as much, and we'd be 2 to 10% poorer. Now, that's what the conventional economics tells you. That's what the Treasury told you before the referendum. That's what their estimates more recently tell you. That is what everybody else's estimates tell you. So you're really, I would say, you would default to that expectation. That is the basic economics. And then you have to ask yourself, do the economists have a sort of groupthink problem in which they're all, are these models out of date? Is there something wrong with those estimates? And some people will say they are. But I would say your central starting assumption would start with what conventional economics tells you. And that says you reduce trade because you lose trade with Europe more than you gain it with everybody else. And you lose some investment as a result of that. And so you're a bit poorer. But by the way, the country may rationally say we'd rather be a bit poorer and have more self-control, more control over our destiny.
So speaking of the European Union and EU relations. Over the past week or so, Donald Trump's trade tariffs and apparent trade war have really been dominating global news. He's been espousing tariffs on steel
and
aluminium,
yeah.
so steel 25, aluminium 10%, I believe. So do you think they'll actually come into place? And if so, will they be here to stay? For how long will they be?
I don't know. It's an interesting one. Look, so what we have to understand is that the United States, over the course of the period of its role as a superpower, so from about 1945, has really built something that most people, I think, in the West regard as rather good, as a sort of world order based on rule of law. And nowhere more so than in the issue of trade. And so, literally, Costa Rica, a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, can go to take America to court and say, you're unfairly discriminating against our imports of XYZ. And Costa Rica can win against the United States. And it's not just, we're the biggest, we do what we want, and we'll tell you. It's a world order. And so, I'm not allowed to have opinions, but and look, a lot of people would regard that world order as a rather good thing, because order is better than disorder and the law of the jungle. And so, if one's honest, a 25% tariff on steel is not actually, in the United States, a thing to get too upset about. It's not a big deal. However, what you might want to get upset about is the attempt just to completely undermine a system that the US has fostered and promoted and has really seemed to be working quite well. It all comes back, I suppose, though, to whether you think the world has been failing or succeeding over the last 6 or 7 decades, or the last 3 decades. And in a way, it has been failing, and it's been failing blue-collar workers in the West. But in another way, it's really been succeeding in that we've had the most stupendous kind of transformation of the lives of so many people in the world. Not all of the poor people, but a lot of the poor people in the world. And so I think where most of us are at is saying to ourselves, how can we improve the working of this global system and this world order so that actually it doesn't punish the poorer people in rich countries as much as it does? And Trump is a bit of a response to the anger of some of those blue-collar workers in poor countries. But has he really found the right way of trying to help them? Well, maybe not, because if he puts up the price of steel, it puts up the price of beer, because beer comes in cans made of aluminium, and so that's going to be more expensive. So does it really work for the people he's trying to help, or is it just a kind of a sort of angry spasm of reaction to the discontent that those communities feel? And I think in some ways that's the debate at the moment, is how do you properly respond to the justified anger that certain communities feel in rich countries without throwing the baby out with the bathwater of a global system that's delivered quite a lot of good as well as some bad.
So talking about Trump, talking about his relationship with the rest of the world, I'd like to finally come on to Russia. I saw you talking about that last night on Newsnight. So only a couple days ago, we saw the latest, Russia incident.
We don't know that yet.
Well, what we think, what we think so far from the information that we have,
we're able to speculate. Wow.
That the former Russian spy named Sergei Skripal was apparently poisoned in Salisbury.
Clearly poisoned. I don't think we have to be speculating wildly when we say that.
So we can say that.
Look, obviously we're all thinking Russia, but I think the question we asked last night with Gabriel Gatehouse's piece is, the reason not to jump to conclusions, there are good reasons not to jump to conclusions on anything, but obviously prime hypothesis is what we'd call Russia. But that can mean a lot of different things, and so we need to be... It's actually one of the things I say in answer to lots of questions is people say the BBC does this, the BBC does that, and I say there is no such thing as the BBC. The BBC is a competing network of fiefdoms who are sort of arguing with each other, jostling for position, and the idea that there is one BBC policy on this or on that is just a sort of mistake. And the same is true, by the way, of the EU, with whom we're negotiating. There isn't one EU. It's a sort of complex, dynamic system. The same is true of Russia. So when we talk of Russia being part of this, we might be referring to Putin and his henchmen and what they get up to. But I think we need to be open-minded about other possibilities within that.
If, in this case, if it is Russia, what should and what can Theresa May and the UK government say to the Russian government, to Putin, provided, as I said, that it is Russia, in order that these kind of...
That it stops.
Yes.
I think the only thing Britain can do is appeal to other countries in the West.
And what can be done globally?
Well, you can have sanctions. I mean, there is one thing the British do have, and it's a really difficult one, which is we are basically a financial centre that has been friendly to oligarchs. Now, some of those oligarchs are friendly to Putin. A lot of them, of course, are unfriendly to Putin. But we have basically taken a sort of don't ask, don't tell approach to where a lot of that money has come from. And I think with regard to some of Putin's friends, we could say, actually, we have procedures for criminals that have not been used in regard to Russian oligarchs. And essentially the principle is unexplained wealth. We want to know, you seem awfully rich for a cellist, and we'd like to know how a cellist gets to have $2 billion. And if you can't tell us, we're going to have that house that you bought in Hampstead. And there is a cellist who is a friend of Putin's, who does have a couple of $1 billion, I'm told, and that would be a good example of how you might say, that's weird, and that if you can't explain where the money's come from legally, then you lose the assets. Now that would be a very costly thing for us to do, because one of the ways we make money is by servicing the rich of the world, and we would be putting off a lot of rich criminals from putting their money here. However, I don't know. I think I would rather we weren't the sort of global money laundering hub. So I'd be in favour of doing something like that. But I think it has to be an effort of the West. There's no point in one country, medium-sized country, trying to punish the Russians, is there? I mean, it just doesn't work.
Thank you very much, Evan.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure.
Cool.